Hello and welcome, everyone. This is the GraphQL Hangout, America's edition. This is episode number 6. I am Budha, product evangelist here at Tyke, and joining me today is Sedky from Tyke as well. So hello, Sedky. Hello and welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to hear everybody's very controversial opinion. If everybody leaves and nobody's pissed off, this was not worth it. I will do my best to cancel the next one. So bring your opinions. Thanks, Budha.
Awesome. Also with us is Agata. Agata, hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I seem to fit into the GraphQL corner, but let's see how this goes.
Well, you can take sides, you can change sides, you can be neutral. Ideally, you should not be neutral, but we'll see how this all works out. But so,
and
as you can
context, I'm sorry to cut you off. For context, Agata is building. She's the senior product owner of GraphQL integration project, and is basically, I'm pretty sure she has GQL in her DNA by now.
So. Yeah, it has changed the last couple of years.
All things GraphQL, that's what Agata is here for us. But we'll see whether we can change her mind as well, perhaps, who knows. But that is kind of what we are going to be tackling today. This is the great API debate where we're going to be looking at REST, GraphQL, and gRPC, and we'll be looking at some of the perhaps pros, some of the cons of each one of these. And that tends to happen. There is no perfect system usually, or at least that's what we believe, but maybe you have a different opinion on that. And at the same time, we'll try and explore, if we can, certain use cases or scenarios under which maybe one of these API styles tends to win out over the others over the course of this session. Also, we'll look at some of the key considerations, perhaps, which might help you to make that decision for yourself in your organization and what that essentially entails. And we'll have a discussion essentially about what you think or you feel about each one of these technologies. Are you using them? Have you had a good experience? Have you had not such a great experience? What were some of your learnings? We would love to hear from you. This is kind of the format of the Hangout, where it is sort of an engaging, hopefully, session where we engage with the audience. And you can tell us a little bit more about your experiences just as much as we'll be sharing our own during this session as well. So without further ado, the way we're going to be kicking things off is going to be, we'll make some opening arguments around each one of these different API styles. We are really looking at just setting the scene a little bit before we deep dive into the debate and the discussion. And of course, your opinions are going to be welcome at any point during this session. So feel free to either add that as part of your chat. You can put it in your Q&A section or unmute yourself and just talk to us about it. Or at the same time, if you want to, be polite about it, don't have to be. Just raise your hand as well, and I'll pick out you from the audience as well. So that's all the admin conversation. So let's kick things off. Hopefully, this is an exciting session, and I'm looking forward to it as well. So let's kick things off with REST, really looking at just basic definitions and certain pros and cons before we get started into the debate itself. And really, if I were to put in the REST hat at the beginning, at this point, what does REST stand for? It is representational state transfer. And before we even get into REST, I think really just to take a step back and think about APIs and what they really enable. APIs are meant to enable system-to-system communication. That is kind of what they are meant to enable in most cases, where you're really looking at operations that are being performed by them, your usual CRUD operations, your create, read, update, delete operations that you're essentially looking at in some cases. And that's kind of what APIs are meant to enable. And by no means are APIs a new concept. They've existed for a very, very long period of time. What we are talking about today are actually a subset of that, or a specific set of that, which is the web APIs. And I think we're going to be focusing on the web APIs today. So REST, not the first one to get started. I think before REST came a few others. You had your RDAs, you had the RPC, you had SOAP, which kind of kicked things off initially. And then REST came in after to solve specific challenges that were faced with SOAP specifically in this particular landscape. So with REST, we had representational state transfer. That is what REST is all about. It's all about making data available as resources. And I think that's quite an important thing there. And it is the popular kid in the block. It is the most popular API style that is being used at this point across most organizations, if I were to put it that way. There's certain pros over there. We've got decoupled client and server systems over here. Essentially, the idea again is to have solutions that are not tightly coupled to each other. You had multiple format support. However, I think the most popular one still tends to be JSON in this case, compared to the XML formats, the verbose XML formats that we had with SOAP. And then it brought a degree of flexibility when it came in initially. So that kind of lends itself into the pros section as well. But at the same time, sometimes the flexibility leads us down the cons section. I'll have a little bit of a code, which is quite interesting that I've found on the internet. The cons over here is there is no single REST structure. So there is no definitive way in some cases of saying that this is exactly how your REST structure is going to be created. And therefore, that leaves a lot of room for ambiguity in some cases. And that's where a lot of people get it wrong. Payloads can sometimes be quite big. And then you may succumb to either overfetching or underfetching, which is what we'll talk about a little bit in the next segment around GraphQL. So with REST, I think the key thing that I came across was there is a difference between being restish and there is difference between being restful. I think ideally you want to be restful and not restish. And that's people get it wrong when they're going partial rest and they are taking a few things of rest and not really implementing the whole suite of things that's actually defined in terms of what rest needs to be. So be restful, not restish. That is kind of the takeaway for me, at least from here. And that leads us very nicely into the next segment, which is onto GraphQL. Now, GraphQL is, I would say, the cool kid almost at this point. And I'm not sure everyone agrees with that, but it is considered to be the cool kid on the block at this point, where you're looking at GraphQL as querying just the needed data. I think that's why it kind of came in, and it had two very specific use cases that became quite popular. One of which was if you have multiple clients or an omni-platform application environment, then GraphQL works out really well. You've got a single underlying data graph, which then needs to pump or furnish information on an omni-channel platform. GraphQL works out quite nicely. On the other end, if you've got multiple data sources that need to be collated together in a way to create a single unified data, that's where GraphQL comes in quite strongly as well. So those two sort of big use cases around GraphQL over here. And if we talk a little bit about the pros, you've got your flexibility that comes in terms of the way you are presenting the information, the way you're presenting the data, puts the onus on the application developer almost to request the information specifically what they need. It fits the graph-like data really, really well, and it really helps with discoverability. Your schema is readily available. The blueprint of your API, the shape of your API is typically available without you really having to go into high-level documentation. High-level documentation, absolutely essential. You should definitely do that across all APIs. There is no alternative to that, but this sort of brings out a couple of things out of the box a little bit better than some of the other API styles. Equally, something that's not here is GraphQL. The way it works, it has your queries, which is your getting or requesting information and getting that back. You've got mutations, which is all about your create, update, and delete operations with GraphQL. But equally, you also have subscriptions, which is built in almost event-driven architecture to a certain degree. You're getting real-time information that is built in, that's native to GraphQL, and that's something that is quite a powerful capability that GraphQL brings to the picture. Cons over here can be knowledge. I think in a lot of cases, we do get this wrong. People are still trying to familiarize themselves with what GraphQL can really truly do. What are some of the pros or some of the cons around that? Handling security challenges, handling caching complexities. We'll get to that a little bit later, because I think sometimes that is quite misunderstood, and we pretty much tend to be dismissive about the fact that GraphQL just can't do caching well, and that's actually not really true. And then finally, we come to performance. Sometimes, again, not entirely a great argument against it, but it is an argument because performance can be a challenge, especially if you're comparing it with something like our next contender, which is gRPC. gRPC is essentially a high-performance, open-source, universal remote procedural call framework. So basic takeaway from that, the underlying thing there is high performance. I think that is kind of the key sort of the USP of gRPC here, is the high performance segment of it. It works across, it works using HTTP2 protocol. And I think that's quite an important thing there as well, because it makes use of the multiplexing capabilities of it, as well as the streaming, specifically streaming capabilities of HTTP2. It enables you to have unidirectional as well as bidirectional streaming, and it's a really, really powerful capability when it comes to, again, looking at performance across your system-to-system communication. In this case, pros, highly performant. That's kind of its thing, really. It is great for server-to-server communication. Really, if you're looking at binary-driven communication across your servers in a highly performance, low latency way, this is the way to do it. At least that's what I believe. It is language agnostic. The way you would create your gRPC API is essentially using interface definition languages, the most popular of which is protocol buffers. And the way you do that is essentially creating almost like a manifest of what your API is going to be, the way it's going to get serialized. And then that essentially helps you generate stubs, which will help you create your client SDKs as well as your server-side application. So that's kind of the power of it. It has that language agnostic nature. However, there are certain cons here as well, because the way it works, it has, I think as it stands, it has support for 11 programming languages right now. And I think the challenge there is if your language is not supported, then it could be a bit of a challenge for you to generate those stubs for you, create those client SDKs for you. You may have to do a lot of work around to be able to get that performance up and running quite easily, which can be a bit tricky. It requires HTTP2, which again should be a no-brainer given that it's been around for a long time now, but it can be a bit of a challenge, especially if you have been living in the HTTP 1.x world for the longest period of time, and all of your systems are built on that. And at this stage, it is not considered to be great for external APIs. If you're looking at how you're going to be exposing your internal APIs for external consumption, gRPC typically not considered to be the best solution out there. So with that, I'm going to halt over here. I think the idea here was to really set the scene in terms of what these different API styles are all about, what some of the pros, some of the cons are all about it. And let's see if we can get into a discussion. I want to get some initial thoughts around what we actually spoke about, and see if you guys have had any experience working with any of these different. I'm sure you've worked with at least one of these, and what your experience has been around. Maybe Sedky, if I just get started with you, your initial thoughts around the different API styles and what we spoke about right now.
Yeah. So anybody who's not using REST as the foundation for their APIs is doing something wrong. And what do I mean by that? So GraphQL and gRPC have their use cases. Most companies out there gonna make up a number that is probably accurate. 99% of companies do not need to use these technologies. REST has been around for 26 years now, something like that, 25 years. The tooling is there.
20-ish years, I think 2000.
20-ish years.
Yeah, 2000 was probably when it was officially I think the official dissertation came out around the REST, what REST is all about. And I think that's when it came into existence. I think the real uptick probably happened a little bit later than that, but yeah, about roughly, we can call it probably 20 years at this point.
Well, 20 something, let's compare that to GraphQL and gRPC, right? Where if you add them up both, it's still not close to REST. So REST, the tooling is there, the patterns are there, the SDKs, the libraries, regardless of your programming language, regardless of the stack, where you are on the front end, the back end, there's true and tested ways about how to do this, which means developer velocity is there, the deployment patterns are there, the CI is there, the CD is there, everything makes sense. Everybody knows how to do it. Now, the trap that people fall into is they start using these technologies for the sake of using these technologies. And there's a lot of situations where people do this, right? They heard of some new sexy programming languages that Facebook and Netflix use, and now they want to do it too. I fell prey to this myself, using GraphQL just for the sake of using GraphQL, because I figured, well, if everybody's using it, it must be good. No, had an atrocious time using it, trying to get developers to use it. The front end patterns changed completely. The way that you query data changed completely. Sure, there's pros, there's cons. The takeaway is to know why you're using these technologies instead of just using these technologies. And so I challenge anybody that's using GraphQL gRPC to defend why they're using gRPC or GraphQL. So for most people, it just doesn't make sense. I can get into situations where both make sense, of course, right? They exist for a reason. But my stance is REST wins 9 out of 10 use cases, if not more.
It's very interesting you say that, because I think if I was, when I was doing the research around this, I think a lot of the article topics that I came across was that rest in peace, GraphQL is the future. And I see that again coming up, because if you really go back in time, it was exactly, it's almost identical to what was said about REST when it first came out, because it was like rest in peace soap, REST is the new kid on the block. And now it's suddenly shifted to the other side, where it's like rest in peace and GraphQL is the new kid on the block. And I think that's where there is this little tendency that I do tend to come across here, where people are just being binary about certain things and technologies, where it's either this or that. Whereas instead of going into a little bit more of a nuanced discussion, now GraphQL is the thing, and therefore you should be using it. If you're not doing it, you're doing it wrong. Compared to say, okay, GraphQL was meant, it is built for a specific purpose, or gRPC is built for a very specific purpose, and based off of your requirements, you really should consider it. And the requirements are not typically just business requirements or even technical requirements. I think there's a third case there, where there is a human requirement there as well, where you have to have 3 levels of considerations to actually consider any technology. You've got your business requirements, you've got your, what your product needs and what kind of goals and objectives you're really going after. You've got your technical needs in terms of, what kind of complexity you want to go for, what kind of performance you want to get at, what is going to be the longevity of that technology that you're going to be looking at as well. And then you've got the third component, which a lot of people do miss out on sometimes, is also the human component, where you need to think about, okay, what kind of knowledge base do you actually have? What kind of expertise do you have? And how much time do you want to spend to maybe investing in a new technology? Yes, in some cases it might make sense, where because it just fits your use case so extremely well that it's worth making that investment in that human component. But in a lot of cases, maybe it's not. For your organization, it might be easier for you to get up and running with something that you're familiar with, and the challenges associated with it, and how to get around some of that, compared to something else. So that's kind of my way of sort of looking at it in terms of technology. So that's my takeaway here.
Yeah, no. So I agree with what you're saying. In principle, there's a time and a place for everything. So we can look at some situations too, where just to nitpick on GraphQL. So there are use cases with GraphQL, makes sense, right? So GraphQL, like you said, it's an omni-channel development. So if I have an iOS app, an Android app, web app, and they all want to consume the same API, GraphQL makes it easy. You get to select the language that you want. If you are a single team that's building on a front end, you control the back end, the front end, then please explain to me why you're using front end. If it's a single team with one back end, even if you're building different applications, it doesn't make sense to me. So I do agree with you. The other use case for GraphQL that does make sense is an integration play. So we have X amount of backends. I want to expose it as a single GraphQL facade. And then perhaps you expose the GraphQL on the front end. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe you restify that back. So we're going from REST to GraphQL to REST. And it sounds crazy to people listening to that without having tried that before, though. There are pain points that push you to go there that I haven't really mentioned yet. So for example, why would you do that? Why not just expose to GraphQL? Well, in practice, you run into all sorts of tooling issues and backwards compatibility changes and breaking a schema, which breaks one client, but not the other, and all this kind of stuff. And you figure, well, maybe it's fine to just keep GraphQL as this nice little piece in the middle and then expose it as REST again on top. So with that said, yeah, so REST, in my opinion, is always going to win over, but GraphQL does have its places. The other point I wanted to make was about over architecting. So you brought up a really good point there, Budha, where as I'm designing an API, I have to consider not just the human element, but the scalability and a bunch of other factors. That one word, scalability, is critical. A lot of engineers are designing their applications for this insane scale that they may or may not never hit. Hopefully they do. The problem is the trade-off that they accept is way too much delay into getting a feature or a product or an MVP shipped out because they want to make it perfect. So a common trap to fall into is making everything perfect and infinitely scalable and built on the cloud, with all this kind of stuff. And it's really interesting because reading the Hacker News corners of the world, it seems that we're coming full circle, and a lot of engineers are going back to the true and tried monolith, making sure, there's no need to split into microservices. Just use a Java or a PHP backend. You don't need to use a single page application, which is bloated with JavaScript. Just use a, so I wouldn't go quite that far, though. I agree with the concept is we get way too fancy. Your blog does not need to be built on Next.js and React and Virtual, even though mine is right now. So
well, it's true with technology in general, isn't it? Like, I think when something new comes in, there is that tendency of ours to say, like, this is the next big thing, and if we don't get on it, then we are going to be missing the bus. And I think that's where a lot of times people just forget about the complexity of the future, perhaps, or like, is it really for us, the investment that's going to go into it? Why do we actually want to consider something like this? But again, at the same time, I do want to bring in a bit of a balance to this conversation and say, like, there is definitely a reason for these technologies to exist. A lot of them don't exist simply because, people had free time to build it. They put in a lot of effort into building it, and they were based on specific use cases, and they were trying to solve specific challenges. Especially if I think about it from a gRPC standpoint, I think there is a case to be made in terms of the performance that you can get with gRPC in a server-to-server environment. And I think that kind of goes away, especially in any kind of facade-based or an abstraction layer-based API style, whether that is a REST or whether that is GraphQL. And I think gRPC stripping that away can be a lot more powerful as a toolkit in your arsenal. I do want to get to Agata as well, given that I think I've heard a significant amount of stuff around or against GraphQL at this point. I would really want to get your opinion around it, whether you agree with it. Hopefully you disagree with some of that as well. So Agata, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, one thing that resonates with me a lot is what you just said. I'm the kind of person that when a new macOS system comes out, I will wait probably a month or a month and a half, just to see if nobody's crashing dramatically, and only then I will upgrade, right? So my road to GraphQL was kind of like that. I've worked with REST APIs for a majority of my career. First with the monoliths, then, microservices started to be the thing. And actually the client I was working for just jumped on them from the very beginning. It didn't go well, like really didn't. And then once we got to the microservice architecture, somehow in
oh no,
GraphQL came out, and and then GraphQL came out, and if now that I look at it with the perspective of I won't say how many years, but yes, now that I look at it, it's like, why did we even touch it? Like, why did we even touch it? Because, and I have to say, where we are right now with GraphQL, I think it's a completely different place from 2015 when it was first open sourced. There's a lot of community work that has gone into it. The GraphQL Foundation has been very active. I was watching a talk a couple of days ago about the defer and stream directives. They are just, the new thing kind of in GraphQL. So like the community actually, I think, rallies around the language, the GraphQL language to make it fit as many use cases as possible. Although some things are still hard. If you think about the basic things that with REST don't really, like, you don't even think about them, like rate limiting, right? In GraphQL world, that's a completely different beast. And you can rate limit all you want your GraphQL APIs, but if someone sends you a query that is nested 100 times over, your server will fall over anyway. So I'm not saying like, GraphQL is not perfect, and I know it isn't. And, very well, we at Type, we also have discussions about, how we should handle certain aspects of GraphQL in our product. But I think all in all, the benefits and the way the community rallies around the problems is a big advance of GraphQL right now.
That's a good point, because I think a lot of times that's important for any technology adoption, because you if you don't have a really active community that's helping build out some of the, oh, you went mechanical again. Okay. If you have an active community that is really looking after some of the use cases that are coming up, and in sometimes I think what happens is with technologies, you may come across use cases that initially you hadn't even thought about that it could potentially solve as well. And we've seen that previously with some of the earlier technologies that came in as well. And I think while you mentioned GraphQL not being a perfect system, I would actually argue that I think none of the systems are actually perfect. I think if you really go into REST, because of the way REST is less defined, or the way, or almost the ease with which people get started with it, they almost inevitably do it wrong every single time, and there is a problem that's associated with it, and a lot of times that doesn't get caught up really early. It only comes in when you've already probably built a significant chunk of your system already, and then you start receiving those issues and problems and challenges that come around that. And same goes with gRPC. It's really good with where it's meant to be, but if you really start thinking about how are you going to be exposing gRPC APIs for external consumption, I think things are going to fall apart a little bit quite quickly. I think it's just not ready as a technology to be able to manage that. So almost the paradigm there is you go gRPC for your internal server-to-server communication, and then if you're looking at external communication, you almost put in a REST on top of that, or a GraphQL on top of that, depending on what your ultimate consumption platform is really going to be. One question that always comes up is around caching, right? I think caching comes up quite significantly when it comes to GraphQL, that GraphQL just can't
I would say
caching.
caching and authorization as well. Those would be like two topics that always bump up somehow.
Yeah, so I think just if we
they
were
can get tricky.
If we were to dissect caching a little bit, I think what people think about caching a lot of times, they tend to evaluate caching as network-based caching. There are actually three kinds of caching that you can have. You've got your server-side caching, you've got network caching, and you've got client-side caching. So with GraphQL, I think the biggest challenge there is really about not having, because you're working with posts typically, that's how GraphQL APIs tend to work. You are kind of limited when it comes to the network caching layer. However, when it comes to something like your server-side caching or your client-side, I think you can still handle that. I don't see there being any challenges around that. But a lot of people tend to believe because of the network layer being missing there in terms of caching, you can't really go up there. So thoughts on that, Sedky, in terms of just the caching element of it? Is that really as big a challenge as people make it out to be?
It is. Yeah, it is. It is because the browsers assume a lot of stuff based off of what you send, your HTTP verb, right? That's all built in. Like you said, with GraphQL, there's ways around it, but with a post, we no longer get the advantage of all the built-in caching that your browsers and CDNs and everybody that just give you out of the box. So now we have to implement caching. We have to tell our server to cache X and validate Y. It's a whole other set of problems. So it very much is a real problem. I mean, GraphQL isn't real. It's just the thing. I don't mean that negatively. I just mean it's this thing that goes over HTTP with a payload. But like you said, the fact that it uses post just means we can't take advantage of the caching. With that said, I mean, there are GraphQL clients that do that quite well out of the box. I'm blanking right now, but yeah, there's a couple that account for that.
Persistent queries, I think, is quite a powerful capability there. I think if you make use of persistent queries, especially server side, I think can be quite a powerful way of dealing with this at this point. I think one of the challenges that the community sort of looked into, but I totally agree. I think caching tends to be brought up quite significantly here, but I still feel I'm not sure if it is as big a challenge as it is said in terms of eliminating GraphQL as a technology in its totality, because you could face similar issues with REST as well. Again, it depends on how you're designing it, right? Because you could have, if you are adding a query at the end of every single one of your API URLs, then your REST is not going to be cacheable either, right? You're not essentially going to be able to cache that. If you've got a /user/1, for instance, that information, very easy, very well done. But after that, if you're doing a question mark Q or T equals something, or you're putting a query, then your REST kind of moves away from that capability as well. So it comes down to, again, perhaps how you're designing it. But yes, pound for pound, REST probably wins out a little bit here for sure in terms of the way it can cache information versus GraphQL. You do have that little bit of workaround necessary to get there, but it's not probably as bad as perhaps people make it out to be. But again, that's probably not the best argument in favor of any technology.
No, I think it's a great argument. I would take it a step further and say, sure, we've agreed that caching is a problem in GraphQL, being worked on, though, a problem. So what are the trade-offs? Well, the trade-off, the reason you would accept less over the network performance is because of the performance we get elsewhere. What are those performances? Well, scalability. So the reason I would use GraphQL in any environment is, again, is to enable API developers to build faster, which has nothing to do with caching, but that's the trade-off. The GraphQL, what it gives you is the ability to query a single endpoint, like you say, one post, and then let the server figure out where to get the data from. So with that in mind, I like your approach of persistent queries to put on top of it. Although, like you say, I'm not sure for very intensive applications, high throughput, think of Amazon, if they're really able to get away with that. So it certainly depends on the scale, I would say.
True. And again, I think you yourself made that point earlier on, right? Where not every organization is a Netflix or an Amazon. They don't need that kind of scale in most cases. So if you're really on day one, plan on being an Amazon, perhaps, maybe you'll get there for sure. But in most cases, you're not there yet. And probably it'll take you a while before you reach that scale of a Netflix, where you have to think about federated graphs at a scale where you're looking at maybe 100,000 subgraphs being federated together in a single gateway or something on those lines. You're probably going to be starting off a lot smaller. So those issues, some of those issues may not be as amplified as you may believe initially, especially if you read a lot of these articles, because these are like the common tropes that come up across all of these different technologies, where it's just the same points being harped on over and over again. And the bad rep that REST tends to get all the time is overfetching and underfetching, and it's always that argument for GraphQL over REST, because REST just can't give you that flexibility of providing you exactly what you need. To a certain degree, I would agree with it, but at the same time, again, comes down to the way you're designing your APIs, right? If you have designed your APIs with a specific requirement in mind, you are going to get back exactly what you wanted out of that API. So it really comes back to that conversation. So it's very interesting when once again, when people go very binary with this conversation sometimes.
Yeah, it becomes a religion. Yeah, that's. I'd love to hear from the attendees. Yeah. If anybody on the Horn has a really strong opinion about when to use which of the following technologies,
or just experience on this. I mean, if you've used these and face challenges, any lessons, any learnings, I think any of that area kind of attracts you, please let us know. I'm just going to go around the room. If you are comfortable, unmute yourself and tell us your story a little bit. I see Jerome here. Maybe Jerome, if you are comfortable, let us know a little bit about what your experience has been.
Yeah, sure. I haven't worked with gRPC, but I've worked with REST more so, and just have a little experience working with GraphQL. But and about 2 months ago, I read a paper. Well, actually, it was an article. GraphQL, it's the killer of REST. Very common. I expected that giggle, and but one of the things that I was reading the comments on it, and one of the I think when you sum up the comments that came out of it, it was much more, well, this is something it's better to help REST more than a REST killer, and that you can take some of these REST queries and maybe package them into GraphQL in some way. I don't know anything about designing GraphQL from the server side. I've only used it from the client side. But one thing I do appreciate about GraphQL is that you can take just one trip to get a lot of data that you need, rather than to take a few trips to assemble something that's made up of some data that's in different made up of different related pieces. So that's I guess
that's certainly a big advantage. Yeah, is the way I've seen it described is we're shifting the complexity of relationships from the API consumer to the API owner. So the go-to example imagine we're building a landing page for Twitter. We have to get the user information for a given user ID. We have to get back all of the posts that were written by that user, and then we have to get back all of the comments that were in for each of those posts. And so if I'm building this front end, I can make those API calls, and there'll be about 15 or 20, right? If we think about the relationships there, or if the API developers are offering a GraphQL API, then those three entities are already constructed in a way that, well, the relationships just exist in the backend. I just have my data structure and I query it and I get back all of that data from a single endpoint, and the fetching happens, behind the scenes, outside of my purview. I do not care about it, i.e. So I think it's definitely one of the stronger benefits of GraphQL. Jerome, I would definitely agree with that. GraphQL, especially in this use case, is no different than a backend for front end. Of course, they're way different in their application, but the way that you've described it, the way that the benefit here is identical for both architecture patterns.
And I think if I go back to the philosophy of the two technologies, I think if you look at REST and GraphQL again, REST was again meant for you to retrieve very specific resources based on the URL. So it's constructed in that way where you're retrieving specific information. You're not going to be deviating off that path too much unless you're using queries and things like that. But really the idea is if you're doing a /users, you're going to get a list of users. You're going to do /comments, you're going to get a list of comments. Go /user/1, you get information about a specific user. And that's kind of what REST is really meant to be. If you're trying to deviate too much from that, sometimes it can be a bit of a challenge, where again, if you're looking at multiple variations of that in terms of the consumption patterns of that specific API, then it may not fit things as nicely because it was not built to do that initially. But obviously you can go around that through your design requirements. And the same, on the other hand, where GraphQL again comes in is, like you said, you've got all of these different data that's been brought together in a really, really nice, neat, almost in this way, predictable way. And I'm not calling it predictable from the back end side of things as much as it is predictable from the front end side of things. And that's an important distinction here, because from a back end perspective, things can become a bit of a challenge almost, because things are not as predictable. The shape of your request may not be as predictable, and therefore the way you might want to handle security may be a little bit different compared to REST. But the power where you see GraphQL coming in quite strongly is really around product teams, and product teams tend to enjoy GraphQL a little bit more here because of that degree of flexibility. If you're thinking of future proofing, sometimes if you're looking at building in more channels into your platforms and bringing in those capabilities, you can very easily look at GraphQL as one of the solutions that can get you there. Again, not a perfect solution, but it is it's meant to be purpose built for this one of these requirements. So yeah, it's definitely a good point in terms of the network calls that you might have to make to retrieve the information. It's meant to be more efficient than something like a REST in this case. But again, you can always design REST to do things that are similar to GraphQL. I think that is kind of the main argument. Whether you want to or not, whether you're going to do it well or not, that is really up to you. There is no substitute. There is no technology substitute for bad design ever. You can screw up REST just as badly as you can screw up gRPC or GraphQL. So if you are designing things badly, there is no substitute for that. No form of technology is really going to help you out with it. So, well, that's my sort of 2 cents on that. Architects or technology experts to say, okay, this is what would benefit you the most? Or do you also see people coming in and say, we've heard about gRPC, I think we want to do gRPC and help us do it? Do you usually see that side of the conversation?
No, that's a great question. So yeah, I've talked to probably well over 300 customers or clients, if you wish, here over the last couple of years. So gRPC, very, very, very small, a tiny amount of a fraction of those 300 were used gRPC in production, maybe one handful worth of them. And again, that's not because gRPC is wrong. It's because people are correctly using gRPC when they're supposed to, which is when they hit performance issues, they need the next level. So we really don't see it that much. Nowadays, with the introduction of service meshes and so on, gRPC is becoming a lot more prevalent. but we'll leave that alone. So the question is, how many people are using GraphQL? How many people are using REST? And what kind of help do they need with both? So with GraphQL, it's becoming, again, unfortunately, I wish I had the fact, but I would say about 1 in 8, 1 in 9 customers are using GraphQL, but a large majority of them are interested in it, have seen it, and want to use it. So everybody's using REST to some degree, shape, or form. A lot of them have moved on to GraphQL, and then a small percentage of those GraphQL people are looking at federation. So they have multiple graphs deployed in production. They're using federation to automatically merge them into a bigger graph. When people want our help, it's because they already have a program or a problem and they want to make it better. They want help. They want to take their API management platform to the next level. So yeah, that's just some of the stats. I guess ANIC stats, if that's a word. But no real pattern in terms of here's what we need. That's a really interesting thing about my job. I'm very fortunate is no 2 customer problems are the same. I get to unpack each one of them and help people through it. And it's really interesting because you take something like an API, a REST API, GraphQL API, you would assume that a lot of the problems are generic. And of course there are, but a lot of the problems are unique as well, which is quite fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where I land as well. I mean, obviously I'm not as client facing perhaps as you are, but general conversation discussions in these hangouts and conferences, I think there is a definite high degree of interest in these technologies, especially GraphQL and to a certain degree gRPC as well. I think it's like I said, I think it's like the REST is kind of not the old school, but it's the popular kid. You've got GraphQL as the cool kid, and then gRPC as the new kid, and you've got the 3 levels and degrees of interest accordingly, almost, because people are familiar with REST, and therefore, you know, they kind of like it. They like it or dislike it in some cases because they have been with it for too long, and like they know there are problems and challenges with some of this stuff. Then there are people who are really excited by what GraphQL can bring to it, but then there are people who have used it in production and they've realized that it's not all sunshine and rainbows, which is kind of sometimes what a lot of articles, again, I almost feel like a lot of articles do disservice to technologies when they are saying this is the REST killer, or if something is put to that pedestal.
No, that's people clickbaiting.
Ever, exactly. It's a bit clickbaity, but I think a lot of people take it seriously as well, because a
They
lot
do,
of times
of course.
conversations are about GraphQL is the next iteration, the next generation of APIs. And it really is not. It was never meant to be. It was meant to solve specific problems and specific challenges with REST. And maybe it does some of those in a really, really good way. And some of those, perhaps it's still a work in progress. But just having those expectations being set to that degree initially can really lead you to disappointment in anything, because you're putting it in such a pedestal that unless it's really a perfect system, it is never going to really live up to that expectation sometimes, I think.
Yeah, no, you nailed it. I would summarize it in a sentence by saying use the correct tool for the job. Actually, that's one. The other one would be that these are not competing protocols. Yep. These are complementary protocols, all 3 of them. Companies could easily use all 3 if they had the right jobs for it, right? And they could go away with using just one of them. But they would have it's like, you know, would you race an 18-wheeler around a track, or use a Ferrari to tow cargo? No, you wouldn't do that. Either of those. You could, but you wouldn't, right? There's a tool for the job. And it's not, CV-driven development has caused loads of damage, irreparable damage, because developers want to use the sexiest, the brightest thing. I'm guilty of this myself. Padding your CV should be done. There should be time put aside to do that stuff, to POC and to build, not to make production level decisions based off of that.
There was a very interesting talk in one of the GraphQL communities in Poland lately, where someone was talking about how would you, for example, because with GraphQL, I think we can all agree, you know, the community, it's not only the community, the GraphQL Foundation, we are coming up with more and more universal directives, you know, and one of the things that a lot of people like in GraphQL is, for example, the deprecation, right? The deprecate directive, where it really does help you document and have a like a preemptive message to your users, right? Like this is going to be deprecated. This has been deprecated. Use this instead, right? And there was a very interesting talk in one of the Polish GraphQL communities lately, where someone was arguing that applying a lot of the features of GraphQL ecosystem on how you actually document your your RESTful APIs can have a lot of benefits. So maybe this is an idea for future discussion, but I can see, like, you know, GraphQL does have have its benefits. Sorry, it's late. It does have its benefits, and you know, anyone who has ever tried to use it can probably recognize most of them. It has its drawbacks, yeah, I agree, and you know, we are sometimes skeptic in our team as well of GraphQL and how it's done. Like we've spoken about caching, we've mentioned authorization, but you know, there's, for example, how you monitor your GraphQL APIs. This gets really complicated at some point. It's not just an HTTP endpoint, right? Like you have to know much more. But I can see that there is good stuff coming out of GraphQL that is being actually adopted on the RESTful side, which surprised me, to be honest. And
actually that's the world that I would love to live in, because that's kind of the harmony that I would like to see across technologies, where there is shared learnings, because like I said, they're built to solve specific problems, and if you can learn from each one of them, then why not do that? A conversation again that comes up quite frequently against GraphQL is around not having the ability to version APIs. But if you really drill down to the idea of versioning was never a mandate ever for any of these APIs. Like REST was never meant to be versioned. GraphQL is never meant to be versioned. Versioning is something of a business requirement that people came up with sometimes to sort of smoothen out the transition process on the evolution of APIs coming over. Now, the debate can therefore be there that, do you actually need to have versions? Do you want to call it a version 1, version 2, or would you like to just give it a different name and call it a different API? You could very easily do that. And there's nothing stopping you from doing that with GraphQL either. So, and of course, there are, you know, there's a pros and cons of doing either one of them. But again, versioning. So what I'm trying to bring out here is that a lot of times when there are arguments against a specific technology, it is kind of like the crowd chanting the same thing that they may have read somewhere, and without really looking into the depths of, okay, is it truly a con? Is it really that big a challenge? Is it really a deal breaker in our case? And therefore make an informed decision based off of that, because some of these things have never really been mandated by any of these technologies that, you know, you must version this way or that way. Just like documentation is such a big question mark with a lot of these technologies, because people believe that because GraphQL is self-documenting, then you don't need to do any work around that. It's complete nonsense. It is not, not the way to do it. You got to document
it's a really good selling point, you know. Forget about documentation. It will be done by itself. Like,
you don't need to write unit tests either. It's strongly typed.
Yeah.
Like I said, I think there is no alternative to bad API design. And it's very interesting because we cover some of the stuff in our latest podcast episode coming up, I think in the next couple of days, with James Higginbotham. And what he's really focusing on is designing of web APIs. And he's come up with this framework, which is called the ADDR. I'm not sure if I'm going to get it right, but it's align, define, design, and refine. And it's really that iterative process where your align phase is really about getting those requirements and also running a bit of POC to make sure that the technology and everything is supporting your requirements and it's going to go in the direction in which you're going. And then you go into the actual definition of what you're building, the specifications around it. Then you design it and then you refine, which is the iterative side of things. So it's kind of a learning journey. And at the early stage, perhaps if you come across, you want to try something out, try it out by all means. And if you've got tools that can enable you to do that, you should be able to use all of that. And I think for us, the interesting part obviously is that we are part of the discussion because we are just enthusiasts in the world of APIs and we've got our strong opinions. But really, if you think about it, take a step back and look at Tyke, we support all of these different API styles. We've got support for gRPC, REST, and GraphQL. And we've looked at some of these challenges specifically around security, where I think what Agata mentioned earlier on with security being, you can write a query with so many different nodes in there, as well as perhaps the level of depth that you can go into with it. You can just have nested fields all over the place, which is not always desirable. So there are ways in which you can stop that. And we've taken a very hard look in enabling you to adopt technologies which will solve your business problems without going through some of the hassles, at least, of the cons that come with it. So we've tried to address some of those issues around security, around the way you might want to extend the technology with the API gateway, with the API management, with Tyke. So I think for us, it's a very interesting discussion because we are learning as we are going along in terms of what some of those evolving needs are and how you can get up and running really, really quickly. And try it out for yourself. I think don't be limited by just the resource and the stuff that you learn. Definitely try it out for yourself and see whether the technology really resonates with you or not, whether it's really solving some of your problems. Don't follow the crowd, even if there are like 10 experts just screaming on the top of their voice that this is the thing to try out, the thing not to try out. Ultimately, everyone's human and everyone has their own biases based on their own experiences. So you should try it out for yourself. And if you want, discuss with us, tell us what your experience has been. And we would love to hear from you. We've got our own opinions, as you've heard today, as much as balance as I was trying to bring to the table, I think. But yes, we would love to hear from you. So let us know. This has been a great discussion. Any parting comments, Agata, Sedky?
Yeah. Thanks for putting up with us. So I would certainly say, although use the right tool for the job, I would say 99% of the time REST is good enough. So think critically about why you're using gRPC, why you're using GraphQL. Again, these are technologies I've used in the past, companies I've used successfully using today in the past. So just but also on the flip side of that, run into situations where companies are using both in the wrong situations, and that introduces so much pain. So I hereby declare REST as the ultimate winner, and unanimously, it's clearly. Yeah, but no, thanks everybody for joining. Jerome, thank you for your input. Everybody else for listening. Appreciate you guys.
Thank you so much, everyone. Yeah, for me, the winner, while there's no specific technology, I would put my money on gRPC, not because of flexibility, but just the power of performance within inter-service communication. I think for me that is very attractive as of now. But yes, pound for pound, REST I think probably wins it. But I'm gonna go with my opinion, which is it depends. And that is the TLDR for today. Thank you once again, Jerome. Thank you everyone for joining, and hopefully we'll see you next time with more questions, more exciting discussions on this. So cheers, everyone. Take care and see you next time.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.